A little girl named Rosie, only 8 years old, stands shivering at the doorstep of her aunt and uncle, begging for shelter. But, instead of comfort, the door slams shut. With her baby brother in her arms, she walks into the darkness, snow crunching beneath her tiny shoes, nowhere to go. And just when all hope seems lost, headlights sweep across the frozen road. Officer Daniel Hayes, on patrol with his loyal German shepherd Rook, notices the children. That single moment would change all of their lives forever. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more stories of hope and second chances. Wishing you a peaceful heart and a blessed day. The autumn wind swept through the small American town of Willow Creek, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain-soaked leaves and chimney smoke. Clouds hung low over the streets, heavy with the promise of another storm. On the outskirts of town, where narrow dirt roads threaded past fields and sparse groves of oak, a modest wooden house once stood, warm with the glow of family life. That night, however, flames clawed at the sky, devouring timber beams and windows, until the structure crackled and moaned like a dying creature. Sparks flew upward, swallowed by the darkness, while the town sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Inside the burning wreckage, 8-year-old Rosie Carter clutched her baby brother Ethan to her chest. Rosie was a thin child, with long, tangled brown hair streaked with ash, wide green eyes that carried more strength than a girl of her age should have, and a small mouth quivering as she tried not to cry. Her body bore smudges of soot, her dress torn and clinging to her thin frame. Rosie had always been spirited, playful in days when her home was whole, a girl who liked to hum her mother's songs while rocking Ethan to sleep. Yet the fire hardened her in an instant. Her small arms shook as she shielded Ethan, but her resolve was firm. She would not let go of him. Ethan, not yet 1 year old, was a fragile baby with pale skin, downy blonde hair, and large blue-gray eyes that watered from the smoke. He pressed his tiny fists against Rosie's chest, whimpering with confusion at the chaos around him. Though he was too small to understand the loss unfolding, his trembling body leaned into Rosie's warmth, as if sensing she was his only refuge. By dawn, the fire had consumed the house entirely. Only a pile of blackened wood and collapsed beams remained, the air still thick with smoke. The Carter family was gone, both parents trapped in the inferno. Rosie and Ethan survived only because their mother had screamed for them to run, pushing them through a side door before the roof collapsed. That desperate cry echoed in Rosie's ears long after the flames died. The funeral was small, rushed, and somber. A handful of neighbors came, whispering condolences, their eyes sliding away as if grief were contagious. Rosie stood by the graveside, clutching Ethan, who whimpered softly against her shoulder. She wore a borrowed dress too big for her, sleeves dangling past her wrists, and her thin face was pale with exhaustion. She didn't fully understand death, only that her parents would never come back, and that the world had grown infinitely larger and colder overnight. When the last stick of incense smoldered out, the mourners drifted away one by one. The yard fell silent except for the wind hissing through the grass. Rosie looked at Ethan's flushed face, his tiny chest rising and falling, and knew she had to be strong. "I'm your big sister," she whispered to him. "I won't cry. I'll take care of you." Her words wavered, but her grip tightened as if she could anchor both their lives with sheer willpower. With no home left to return to, Rosie thought of her father's brother, Henry Carter, who lived on the other side of town. Henry was a man in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and steel-gray eyes. He had once been a construction worker, his arms thick with muscle, but years of hardship had hardened him into something colder. His cheeks were perpetually shadowed with stubble, and he carried the air of someone who believed the world owed him more than it had given. People in Willow Creek knew him as curt, often harsh, a man who demanded respect but rarely offered kindness. He had a bitter edge, the kind that came from debts, disappointment, and a life that had not unfolded the way he imagined. Henry's wife, Marjorie, was a 38-year-old woman with neatly tied auburn hair, thin lips, and sharp brown eyes that always seemed to be calculating. She often dressed with deliberate neatness, favoring gray sweaters and pressed skirts that spoke of her desire to appear respectable, even if their finances were strained. To strangers, she could offer polite smiles, but underneath lay an impatience that often soured into cruelty. She remembered clearly that Rosie's father still owed them money, $3,000 never repaid, and to her, debts outweighed blood. Rosie carried Ethan along the dirt road leading to Henry and Marjorie's house. The iron fence surrounding it loomed high, the kind of fence that seemed more intent on keeping people out than welcoming them in. Her arms ached under Ethan's weight, her small legs stumbling on uneven stones, yet she pressed on. With every step, she whispered to her brother, "Just a little more. They'll help us. They have to." When she reached the gate, Rosie's hand trembled as she knocked. 3 small taps echoed through the quiet yard. The door opened and Marjorie appeared, her lips pressed tightly together. Her eyes fell on Rosie and Ethan, and rather than softening, they narrowed as if assessing an unwanted burden. Rosie's heart pounded. She hugged Ethan closer, his baby head tucked beneath her chin, and said in a trembling voice, "Aunt Marjorie, please, let us stay. I'll work. I'll do everything right, I promise. Just don't send us away." Marjorie crossed her arms, her face flat. "There's no room here for extra mouths. Your parents left debts they never repaid. Who's going to pay that now?" Her words fell like stones, cold and unyielding. Rosie's eyes filled with tears. "They're gone. Please, we have nowhere else. You can't just—" Heavy footsteps sounded behind Marjorie. Henry stepped forward, filling the doorway like a wall. His voice came hoarse and sharp. "Go away. I can't feed you. Don't stand here and bother us." His expression was stone, the kind that saw pleading not as sorrow, but as weakness. Rosie's knees buckled and she dropped down on the cold doorstep, still clutching Ethan with one arm while pressing her other hand against the brick floor. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Please, Uncle Henry, just give me a corner of the house. I'll take care of him myself. I'll do every chore. We won't bother anyone." I swear Henry's scowl deepened. "No means no." "Don't dream about it." Ethan began to cry, his wailing sharp and weak, making Rosie more frantic. She bent her head to the floor, her small shoulders trembling as she whispered, "Please don't drive us away." "I have nowhere else to go." But Henry had already turned his back. Marjorie sighed, not with pity but with irritation. She pulled the door, her voice flat as iron. "Find somewhere else to live. Don't come back." The door slammed shut, the sound of the lock echoing with finality. Rosie remained kneeling on the doorstep, Ethan screaming in her arms, her tears soaking into his tiny blanket. The world seemed to have closed every door at once. The night wind swept across her face, biting and cold, numbing her skin. Rosie staggered to her feet, holding Ethan tight, and stepped back from the gate. The road ahead was dark, no lamps lit to show her the way. With her head bowed, she whispered to Ethan, "It's okay. I'm here. I won't leave you." She took one shaky step, then another, into the emptiness of Willow Creek's night, the iron gate behind her sealing the truth. Every adult she had trusted had turned away. Far across town, Officer Daniel Hayes was making his nightly patrol. He was a man of 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with storm-gray eyes and lines etched deep around his mouth, carved by years of grief and responsibility. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, giving him an older, weathered look. Once he had been full of laughter, but the death of his wife in a car accident 3 years earlier had left him hollow. Since then, he lived only for his work, rarely speaking except when duty required. He carried himself with discipline, yet loneliness clung to him like a second skin. Beside him padded Rook, his 6-year-old German shepherd. Rook was a large dog, with a thick black and silver coat, amber eyes, and a faint scar across one ear from an old K-9 training incident. He moved with both power and precision, trained to protect and serve. Yet Daniel often saw something gentler in him, a loyalty that filled the silence of his empty house. Rook had been with Daniel since his wife's passing, perhaps the only creature who had seen the depth of his grief and refused to leave. As Daniel steered his patrol car through the dim streets, the faint glow of the Carter fire still flickered in the horizon behind him. He remembered another night long ago, the smell of smoke mingling with the sound of sirens, the night he lost everything. His hand tightened on the wheel, and Rook let out a low rumble as if sensing his master's sorrow. Daniel shook his head, pushing the memory aside. He didn't yet know that the same fate had just stripped two children of their family, and that their paths were about to entwine with his own. The following night in Willow Creek was colder than the last. The rain had passed, leaving puddles shimmering beneath the streetlights, and the autumn air carried the sharp bite of frost. Rosie Carter trudged along the empty road, Ethan pressed tightly to her chest, his small body bundled only in a smoke-stained blanket. Her thin shoes slapped against wet pavement, and each step felt heavier than the last. The iron gate of her uncle's house was already a fading silhouette behind her, and the silence of rejection rang louder in her ears than the crackling fire that had stolen her parents. The baby whimpered, tiny fists rubbing against his eyes, and Rosie bent her head to murmur, "I'm here, Ethan. I'll keep you warm. Just a little longer." She eventually found shelter beneath the overhang of a shuttered bakery. The wooden boards smelled faintly of old flour, and the flickering neon sign buzzed weakly above. Rosie curled against the wall, resting Ethan across her lap. She pulled her threadbare dress tighter around him, ignoring her own shivers. Above, the clouds thinned just enough to reveal a cold slice of moonlight. It silvered her tangled hair and made the hollows of her cheeks deeper, but she clung to the fragile hope that morning might bring something better. Elsewhere in town, Officer Daniel Hayes sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, parked near the market square. The radio hummed low static, broken only by the occasional report from another unit. Rook, his black and silver German shepherd, sat alert in the passenger seat, ears pricked, amber eyes scanning the dark sidewalks. At 6 years old, Rook was powerful but seasoned, his coat thick against the chill. He had a scar along one ear, a reminder of a violent confrontation during K-9 training, but despite his intimidating build, his temperament was calm and steady. Daniel often thought of Rook as more than a partner. He was a lifeline, the one companion who had stayed when the rest of his life had emptied. Daniel adjusted the rearview mirror, his storm-gray eyes catching his own reflection. The lines around his mouth had deepened since his wife's death, and there was always a heaviness in his expression, even when his lips managed a faint smile. He often patrolled longer hours than required, perhaps not for the sake of law and order alone, but because the thought of returning to his quiet farmhouse filled him with dread. He turned down the heater, cracked the window, and let the cold rush in, a punishment to keep himself awake. Rook shifted, letting out a low rumble as if reminding Daniel he wasn't alone. As the night dragged past midnight, Daniel noticed a flicker of movement near the closed bakery. At first he thought it was just a stray animal, but then he saw the outline of a girl crouched beneath the sign, something small bundled in her arms. He narrowed his eyes, starting the engine, headlights cutting across the puddles. Rook sat forward, tail stiff, sensing tension. Daniel's heart beat faster as the girl's figure became clearer, thin, frail, hunched over, as if to shield the baby she carried. Rosie flinched at the sudden light, tightening her arms around Ethan. Her wide green eyes glistened with fear. "Don't come closer," she whispered hoarsely, though her voice was lost beneath the hum of the patrol car. When Daniel stepped out, tall frame silhouetted against the glow, she pressed herself harder against the wall. Her whole body shook, though whether from cold or terror he couldn't tell. Daniel raised both hands slowly, palms open, his voice steady, but soft. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." His eyes fell to the baby in her arms, noting the bottle clutched loosely in her hand. It was empty, its nipple cracked, and he recognized the faint wail of hunger in the infant's cries. Something twisted in his chest. He remembered another night long ago, when his own daughter had wailed in the dark after her mother's death, and he had felt equally helpless. He hadn't been able to save his family then, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could save this one. Rosie shook her head, voice breaking. "Everyone just looks and walks away." Daniel froze. The words struck like a knife, echoing memories he tried to bury. His father's silence, his neighbor's indifference when tragedy struck. It was all there in her trembling plea. Rook stepped forward, his movements deliberate. The German shepherd lowered his head, ears relaxed, and let out a soft whine. He approached the girl slowly until his thick fur brushed against her leg. Rosie stiffened at first, then, as Ethan reached a small hand toward the dog's fur, she loosened her grip. Rook stood still, patient, amber eyes calm. See? Daniel said quietly. He's on your side. So am I. He pulled a small thermos from his belt pouch, unscrewed the cap, and poured warm milk he had kept for his shift. He carried disposable bottles for emergencies, another habit born from his K-9 duties, and he held one out, filled with steaming liquid. For the baby! Take it. Rosie's eyes darted from the bottle to his face. Her lips trembled with doubt, but Ethan's cries grew louder, desperate. With a shaky hand, she reached forward and took the bottle, quickly pressing it to her brother's mouth. Ethan latched on instantly, sucking greedily, and the sound of his swallowing filled the silence. Rosie's shoulders sagged with relief, and to her shock, tears spilled down her cheeks unbidden. She turned away to hide them, murmuring, "Why do you care?" "Nobody else does." Daniel couldn't answer right away. His throat tightened, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. He thought of his wife's laughter, silenced by shattered glass, of his daughter's short life cut off, of how the world had felt empty since. He swallowed hard and said only, "Because I know what it's like to be left behind." The wind gusted then, sending scraps of newspaper tumbling across the street. Rosie hunched lower, her tiny body shielding Ethan even though the worst of the storm had passed. Daniel crouched down, meeting her eyes at her level. "You can't stay here. The night is too cold. Come with me." Just for tonight, Rosie hesitated, clutching Ethan tighter. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "If you give us hope and then leave, I can't take it anymore." Daniel's chest ached, but his voice remained steady. "I won't leave. I promise." Rook gave a low bark, as if sealing the vow. Rosie finally nodded, weakly. She gathered Ethan's blanket tighter and stood on trembling legs. Daniel extended his hand, but didn't force it. Instead, he simply walked a step ahead, letting her choose to follow. Rook trotted at her side, his thick fur brushing her knee, a silent guardian guiding her toward the waiting patrol car. As Daniel opened the door for her, Rosie paused, her small figure framed by the flickering neon sign of the bakery. For a moment, she looked back at the street, the puddles reflecting the moonlight, the place she had tried to make a shelter. Then she stepped into the car, whispering to Ethan, "We're not alone anymore." Daniel slid behind the wheel, glanced at her through the rearview mirror, and saw her still clutching the baby as if any second she might be forced to run. He didn't push her. Instead, he started the engine and drove through the silent streets, headlights carving a path through the darkness. For the first time in years, he felt as though his empty house might no longer echo quite so hollow. The patrol car rumbled down the quiet country road that wound toward Officer Daniel Hayes' farmhouse on the far edge of Willow Creek. The storm clouds had broken apart, revealing a thin layer of stars above, their pale light falling over the rolling fields and wooden fences. Inside the car, Rosie sat stiffly in the back seat, her arms wrapped tightly around Ethan, as if he might vanish if she let go. Her green eyes darted between Daniel and Rook, who now sat calmly in the passenger seat, his head turned back, watching the children with his steady amber gaze. Rosie did not yet trust the man, but the dog's quiet presence anchored her trembling heart. The farmhouse came into view, a weathered two-story structure with chipped white paint, a front porch sagging slightly at the edges, and a single lantern glowing faintly beside the door. It wasn't grand, but compared to the cardboard and alleys Rosie had known for days, it looked like a palace. Daniel parked in the gravel drive, turned off the engine, and glanced into the rearview mirror. "This is my home," he said quietly, his voice steady, not unkind. "For tonight, you're safe here." Rosie nodded faintly, clutching Ethan closer. When Daniel opened the door, Rook leapt out first, landing with a heavy thud before trotting to the porch. His thick coat shimmered under the lantern's glow, the scar on his ear stark in the light. Yet his tail wagged gently when he looked back toward Rosie, as if urging her to follow. Rosie hesitated at the car door, her bare feet hovering above the cold gravel. Daniel crouched beside her, not reaching out, but speaking softly. "Come on, the ground's cold, but we'll get you inside quickly." Rosie bit her lip, tightened Ethan's blanket, and stepped down, her thin toes curling against the stones. Inside, the farmhouse smelled faintly of wood smoke and brewed coffee. The living room was simple, a brick fireplace with fading embers, a battered armchair, A woven rug stretched across creaking floorboards. On a shelf above the mantel stood a row of framed photographs. Daniel's late wife, with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. A small girl with blonde curls clutching Rook when he was only a pup. Rosie's gaze lingered there before she quickly turned away, sensing it was a place of ghosts. At that moment, the door to the kitchen opened and a woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a cloth. This was Helen Murray, Daniel's neighbor, who often looked after his house when he worked late shifts. Helen was around 50, of medium height, with salt and pepper hair tied in a bun and eyes of faded blue that still carried warmth, despite years of hardship. She had once been a school teacher, but left the profession after losing her only son in a farming accident 15 years earlier. Since then, she poured her kindness into others quietly, cooking for Daniel when he forgot to eat, or tending to Rook when he was injured on duty. Her figure was sturdy, not fragile, her voice soft but firm, carrying both authority and compassion. Helen paused at the sight of Rosie and Ethan, her brows knitting. "Danny," she said, using the name she reserved for him. "What's this?" Daniel rubbed a hand across his jaw, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for explanations. "2 children. Found them outside the bakery. No place to go." Helen's gaze softened when it landed on Rosie. She noticed the girl's trembling shoulders, the dirt smudged across her face, and the fierce way she clung to the infant. Helen's heart tightened with an ache she hadn't felt since her son's absence. She stepped forward, crouched low, and said in a voice as gentle as the creak of old wood, "What's your name, sweetheart?" Rosie looked away at first, her lips pressed thin. But when Ethan shifted and whimpered, she whispered, "Rosie? And this is Ethan." Helen smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. Rosie and Ethan. Beautiful names. She rose and glanced at Daniel, her voice lower. "They look half-starved." Daniel gave a small nod. "I'll make some food." "Can you?" "I'll handle it," Helen interrupted softly. She walked back into the kitchen, the scent of bread and broth beginning to drift into the room. Rosie sank into a corner near the fireplace, refusing to sit on the couch. She laid Ethan across her lap, rocking him gently. Her green eyes roamed the room as if memorizing every exit, her body ready to run at any moment. Daniel sat across the room in the armchair, Rook settling at his feet, massive head resting on his paws. The crackle of the fire filled the silence until Helen returned with a steaming bowl of vegetable soup and a small bottle she had warmed with milk. She set them on the low table, crouched, and placed a hand on Rosie's shoulder. "Eat slowly, dear, and let me feed the baby." Rosie stiffened, clutching Ethan tighter. "No, I'll do it. He only calms with me." Her voice was sharper than she intended, but Helen merely nodded, not offended. "All right, sweetheart. Just remember to eat, too." Rosie fed Ethan first, his tiny lips wrapping around the bottle eagerly. She blew gently on each spoonful of soup before daring to taste it herself. The warmth spread down her throat, and she blinked hard, unwilling to let tears show. For the first time in weeks, her stomach no longer twisted with hunger. Daniel watched in silence, his heart heavy yet strangely lightened at the same time. He thought of how many nights he had eaten alone by this very fire, Rook his only companion, and how different it felt now, with the sound of a baby's gentle sucking and the quiet determination of a child far too young to bear such weight. Later that night, Helen prepared a small guest room upstairs. The bed was neatly made with white sheets, smelling of fresh linen. Rosie stood in the doorway, Ethan heavy in her arms, staring at the bed as if it were a trap. She shook her head and backed away. "If we sleep there, you'll send us away tomorrow." Helen gasped softly, but Daniel stepped forward. He crouched, his voice steady. "That bed is yours tonight. Nobody will send you away." Rosie searched his face, looking for cracks in his promise, then finally nodded, placing Ethan gently onto the soft mattress. Still, when Helen checked hours later, she found Rosie curled on the floor beside the bed, Ethan in her arms, as if even comfort could not erase fear overnight. While the children slept, Daniel sat by the fire with Helen. He poured her a cup of black coffee and leaned back in his chair, staring at the flames. "What am I doing, Helen?" His voice was low, uncertain. Helen sipped slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "You're doing what's right." "That's more than most," Daniel shook his head. "I'm no father." I already failed once Helen reached out, placed a hand on his arm, her touch steady. "You lost, Danny." "That's not the same as failing. These children don't need a perfect father. They need someone who won't walk away." Rook lifted his head then, amber eyes glinting in the firelight, as if echoing her words. Daniel reached down, scratched behind his scarred ear, and felt a quiet resolve settle deep in his chest. He didn't know if he was ready for the path ahead, but he knew one thing. He could not abandon Rosie and Ethan. Not now. Outside, the wind rattled the porch boards, but inside the farmhouse the fire glowed steady. 2 children breathing softly upstairs, and a man, a woman, and a loyal dog below, bound together not by blood, but by a fragile thread of new beginnings. The morning after their first night in Daniel Hayes's farmhouse dawned pale and gray. Mist clung to the fields around Willow Creek, curling along the fences and creeping over the gravel path like ghostly fingers. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of coffee drifted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of bread Helen had baked the night before. Rosie awoke curled on the floorboards of the guest room, Ethan still pressed tightly to her chest. Her back ached, but she didn't dare lay him on the bed. She blinked, disoriented, until she heard muffled voices downstairs, Daniel and Helen speaking softly, the low crackle of the radio beside them. Rosie slowly rose, hugging Ethan, and tiptoed toward the staircase. Each board creaked under her bare feet. From the landing, she could see Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, his police uniform neatly pressed, but his expression tired. Across from him, Helen poured coffee into a chipped mug. The kitchen's small window revealed the foggy fields outside, where Rook was already pacing along the fence, ears pricked and tail stiff, performing his morning patrol as faithfully as any officer. Daniel's voice carried low. "Word's already spreading. Someone saw me bring them home last night." Helen set the pot down with a sigh. "This is Willow Creek, Danny. You know how people talk, but let them. If you're doing right, that's all that matters." Rosie froze halfway down the stairs, her heart thudding. They were talking about her. Later that day, Daniel drove into town with Rosie and Ethan, Rook in the back of the patrol car. He needed supplies, formula, diapers, clothes, and refused to let them stay alone at the farmhouse yet. The town square was bustling with Saturday activity. Children chased each other across the grass, while vendors set out baskets of apples and jars of honey. Rosie kept her head down, clutching Ethan tightly as they walked toward the general store. It didn't take long for whispers to ripple through the crowd. A group of women standing near the bakery door eyed them sharply. One of them, Sarah Whitcomb, was particularly quick to speak. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and thin, with sharp cheekbones and ash-blonde hair always styled into a tight bun. She wore a wool coat buttoned to the throat, giving her the appearance of someone perpetually braced against the world. Sarah had once been warm, but the betrayal of a husband who abandoned her years ago had turned her kindness sour. She became known in town as someone who measured others harshly, quick to judge. "Is that the Carter girl?" Sarah muttered to her companions, her voice carrying just enough. "And that baby? Living with Hayes now? A widower and a cop, raising 2 strays? Doesn't look right to me." Rosie's cheeks burned, though she tried to ignore it. She ducked further behind Daniel, clutching Ethan so tightly he whimpered. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his storm-gray eyes flashing. For a moment, he looked as if he might respond, but he only placed a steadying hand on Rosie's shoulder and led her inside the store. The owner, Mr. Jensen, greeted them with a nod. He was an elderly man in his late 60s, with a broad frame that had softened into age and a full white beard that gave him the look of a kindly grandfather. His plaid shirt smelled faintly of sawdust, and though his joints slowed him, his eyes were keen and gentle. He had run the general store for decades and had watched generations of families grow up in Willow Creek. "Morning, Hayes," Jensen said, his voice gravelly but warm. His gaze flicked to Rosie and Ethan, then softened. "And who do we have here?" Daniel spoke calmly. "This is Rosie and Ethan Carter. They're staying with me now." Jensen gave a slow nod. "Good. They'll be needing plenty. Let's get you stocked up." He moved around the aisles with surprising agility, gathering diapers, powdered formula, and a small bundle of children's clothes from a back shelf. As he worked, he cast a firm glance toward the window where Sarah and her friends lingered, still whispering. "Don't you worry about their talk," he said lowly. "Most of them forget what it means to stand up when it matters." Rosie's chest tightened at his kindness. She managed a small whisper. "Thank you, sir." Jensen's face softened into a smile, and he reached out to pat her shoulder gently. "You're safe now, little one." By the time they left the store, however, the murmurs had only grown. Sarah stood with arms crossed, her cold eyes narrowing. "It's not natural," she hissed to a passerby. "First he loses his wife, now he takes in other people's children." "There's always a motive," Daniel heard her this time. He turned, his tall figure casting a shadow across the cobblestones, his voice sharp but calm. "If you have concerns, Mrs. Whitcomb, you can take them to the station. Otherwise, keep your words to yourself." Sarah blanched but lifted her chin stubbornly. "You can't expect the town to stay silent forever." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he simply guided Rosie forward, refusing to give her fear more fuel. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Rosie sat by the fireplace feeding Ethan. The warmth of the flames eased her shivers, but her mind echoed with Sarah's words. She glanced at Daniel, who sat at the table filling out paperwork, his brow furrowed, his pen scratching against the forms. Finally, she whispered, "They don't want us anywhere." Daniel set his pen down, rubbed his face, and came closer. He crouched beside her, his voice low but steady. "Listen to me, Rosie. People talk because it's easier than acting, but what matters is here." He tapped gently against her chest, then against Ethan's. "And here." He tapped his own chest. "What we build in this house is stronger than their—" Gossip Rook patted over then, laying his massive head on Rosie's lap. She stroked his scarred ear, her trembling easing slightly. Ethan reached a tiny hand to grasp at the dog's fur, and Rook endured it with patient loyalty. Rosie managed a faint smile, the first since leaving the fire. Upstairs, Helen tucked fresh sheets into the children's bed, humming softly. She paused by the window, looking out at the fog thinning across the fields. She had lived long enough to know how quickly gossip could harden into cruelty. But as she listened to the muffled sound of Rosie's laughter at Rook's clumsy pawing, she told herself that this house could hold against it, if only they clung to one another. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the gravel driveway of Daniel Hayes's farmhouse echoed with the crunch of unfamiliar tires. The air was sharp with early winter's chill, and the fields around Willow Creek were dusted with frost that glimmered faintly beneath the fading light. Inside, Rosie sat near the hearth feeding Ethan, who had just begun to giggle when Rook nudged his tiny foot with a cold nose. The warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing lulled the children into a fragile calm. But outside, headlights flared across the porch, scattering long shadows across the farmhouse walls. Daniel, seated at the table completing reports, stiffened at the sound. His storm-gray eyes flicked toward the window. Rook rose instantly, muscles taut, tail stiff, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The German shepherd padded to the door, ears pricked, sensing what his master already knew. Trouble had arrived. When Daniel opened the door, two figures stood at the gate. Henry Carter, Rosie's uncle, leaned heavily against a black sedan, his broad frame filling the dusk with an air of menace. His steel-gray eyes glinted coldly under the brim of his cap, his square jaw set in anger. A thick jacket strained against his shoulders, making him appear larger, more immovable than ever. Behind him stood Marjorie Carter, his wife, her auburn hair pinned neatly as always, though her thin lips curved in a tight smile that held no warmth. She wore a dark overcoat, gloves clasped primly in her hands, but her sharp brown eyes betrayed calculation rather than courtesy. "Evening, Officer Hayes," Henry called, his voice low but edged with mock politeness. "I believe you've got something of mine." Daniel stepped onto the porch, Rook close at his side. "They're not yours," he said flatly. "They're children, and they're safe here." Marjorie's laugh was light but brittle, like glass ready to shatter. "Safe? With a widowed cop drowning in grief? Don't make me laugh, Daniel. Those kids have blood ties. We are family, and you've no right to keep them." Rosie had crept to the doorway. Ethan clutched tightly against her chest. Her green eyes widened in terror as she recognized their voices. Her knees trembled, but she whispered fiercely to Ethan, "Don't listen. They don't want us. Not really. Henry's eyes caught the movement at the door. He stepped forward, his boots grinding the frostbitten gravel. "Rosie," he said, his voice attempting false softness. "Come here, girl. You know we can give you more than this old farmhouse. Think of your brother. We'll see to it he has proper care." Rosie shook her head violently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You turned us away. You said no." Henry's jaw tightened. Circumstances change. His gaze flicked to Daniel, especially when money's involved. Daniel's fists clenched, but his voice remained calm, measured. "You threw them out into the night. Don't pretend concern now. If you want to press this, take it to court." Marjorie's thin smile returned. "Oh, don't worry. We will. And when the judge hears that you are harboring children with no papers, no guardianship rights," she leaned forward, her whisper sharp as a blade, "we'll see who the law favors." Before Daniel could reply, a truck pulled into the drive. Its headlights illuminated the tension at the gate, and the driver, Officer Luis Morales, stepped out. Morales was in his mid-30s, of medium height with warm brown skin and black hair cropped short. His brown eyes were quick, intelligent, and usually softened by humor, though tonight they were serious. Known for his fairness and steady nature, Morales had grown up in Willow Creek and understood both the kindness and cruelty that thrived in small towns. "Evening," Morales called, approaching with a cautious stride. "Everything all right here?" His eyes flicked from Daniel to the Carters, reading the hostility immediately. Henry bristled. "We're here for what belongs to us. Family matters don't concern the law. Family matters concern the law when abandonment's involved," Morales countered, his tone steady but firm. He looked at Rosie, who clung to Ethan as if the baby were her shield. "She doesn't want to go with you." That speaks volumes. Henry's face flushed, his hands balling into fists, but Marjorie tugged his sleeve sharply. "Not here," she hissed. "We'll let the court do its work." With one last glare, Henry turned back toward the sedan. Marjorie followed, her eyes locking with Daniel's in a silent promise of trouble to come. Their car roared down the driveway, leaving behind only the acrid smell of exhaust. Inside, Rosie collapsed onto the rug, Ethan whimpering against her chest. Daniel crouched beside her, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "They can't take you, not without a fight. And I promise, Rosie, I won't let them." Helen appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, her face pale from what she had overheard. She knelt beside Rosie, brushing tangled hair from the girl's tear-streaked face. "Don't you worry, sweetheart," Helen murmured. "You've got people standing for you now." Her eyes flicked up to Daniel's, firm and resolute. "We'll face this together." That night, after the children were asleep, Daniel sat by the fire with Morales, who had stayed behind. The crackle of logs filled the silence as Morales leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "They're going to drag you into court," he said plainly. "Henry's got a temper, but Marjorie, she knows how to twist words. She'll spin this to make you look like a reckless cop meddling where you shouldn't." Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "I can handle a courtroom. What I can't handle is Rosie, thinking she's unwanted all over again." His gaze flicked upstairs, where faint snores told him Rosie had finally succumbed to sleep. "She's been abandoned enough." Rook shifted from his place by the hearth, lifting his head to rest against Daniel's knee. The German shepherd's amber eyes glowed with loyalty, a silent reminder that he was not alone in this fight. Morales gave a small nod. "Then we'll prepare, and when they come, we'll make sure the truth is louder than their lies." Outside, frost thickened across the fields, and the farmhouse stood like a sentinel against the encroaching dark. Inside, however, a fragile bond had already begun to harden into something unbreakable, a promise of protection, no matter how fierce the storm beyond the gate. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and damp over Willow Creek, the kind of weather that seemed to seep into the bones and whisper of unease. Mist hung low across the riverbanks, and the courthouse, a blocky brick structure built decades earlier, stood like a solemn sentinel in the center of town. Daniel parked his patrol car along the curb, stepping out in his crisp navy uniform. His tall frame seemed even more rigid than usual, shoulders squared, jaw tense. At his side trotted Rook, the German shepherd's black and silver coat gleaming faintly under the muted sky. The dog's amber eyes scanned the street, as if already aware of the storm awaiting them inside. Rosie walked between Daniel and Helen, Ethan bundled tightly in her arms. The girl wore a faded blue dress Helen had ironed late into the night, her hair neatly brushed, though a few rebellious strands still curled around her cheeks. Her green eyes darted nervously at every passerby, but she kept her chin high, clinging to the small sense of dignity the dress gave her. Ethan gurgled softly, his small hand clutching at Rosie's sleeve, as if sensing her anxiety. Helen, dressed in her plain beige coat and sturdy shoes, carried herself with quiet resilience, the kind that spoke of decades of hardship weathered without complaint. She kept a hand near Rosie's back, guiding her forward with the calm assurance of someone who had seen many storms, but refused to bow to them. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of varnished wood and paper. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, and the benches lining the hallway were already filled with townsfolk curious to witness the spectacle. Whispers flitted through the crowd like restless birds, speculation hanging heavy. Some gazes carried pity, others skepticism. Daniel felt every eye like a weight pressing against him, but he kept his expression unreadable. At the end of the hall, the double doors to courtroom B swung open. They were met by Judge Harold Whitaker, a man in his early 60s with thinning silver hair, combed neatly back, and deep lines carved into his face from years of stern deliberation. His eyes were sharp, steel blue, and though he carried the authority of the bench, there was a heaviness in his posture. A man who had witnessed too many human failings. He adjusted his robe as he ascended to the bench, the gavel in his hand a symbol of order in a town simmering with discord. On the opposite side of the aisle, Henry and Marjorie Carter were already seated with their attorney, Clifford Greer. Greer was a man in his late 40s with slicked-back dark hair, a thin mustache, and a suit that seemed too polished for the small-town setting. His sharp brown eyes flicked across the room like a hawk's, calculating every angle. Known for his ruthless tactics, Greer had built a reputation as someone who could twist sympathy into leverage and turn facts into shadows. He leaned toward the Carters, whispering something. That made Marjorie smirk, while Henry's jaw remained tight with anticipation. Daniel's own attorney, Rachel Donovan, adjusted her files on the table. Rachel was in her early 40s, with shoulder-length chestnut hair and glasses perched on her nose. Her gray suit was simple, but her presence carried confidence born of experience. Rachel had once worked as a prosecutor in the city, before returning to Willow Creek to care for her aging mother. And though she had traded the bustle of urban courts for small-town disputes, her sharp intellect and unyielding sense of justice had not dulled. She gave Rosie a brief nod of reassurance before turning back to Daniel, her voice low. "Stay calm. Let me handle their games." The session began with the gavel's echo. Greer rose first, his voice smooth, almost theatrical. "Your Honor, my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, are the rightful guardians of young Rosie and her baby brother. Yet, they have been unlawfully withheld by Officer Daniel Hayes, who, while perhaps well-meaning, has overstepped his role and acted beyond the boundaries of law." He spread his hands dramatically. "This is not a question of compassion, but of rights. Blood ties cannot be dismissed by sentiment." Rosie's fist tightened around Ethan's blanket, her breathing shallow. She wanted to cry out, to tell the judge the truth, but her voice stuck in her throat. Rook, sensing her distress, leaned gently against her legs, his steady presence grounding her. Rachel rose calmly, her tone clear and precise. "Your Honor, the Carters claim guardianship, yet the facts show otherwise. The night of the children's parents' funeral, these very people turned Rosie and Ethan away into the cold. We have sworn statements from neighbors, and we will present testimony proving their abandonment. Officer Hayes acted not as a usurper, but as a protector when no one else would step forward." Judge Whitaker nodded, expression unreadable. "Proceed with witnesses." The first called was Miguel Alvarez, a stocky man in his 50s with weathered skin and a kind face lined from years of outdoor labor. A neighbor of the Carters, he removed his worn cap respectfully as he took the stand. His voice was steady, though a touch nervous. "I saw it myself, Judge. That night after the funeral, Rosie came to their door begging with the baby in her arms. Henry told them to leave. Marjorie shut the door right on their faces. I couldn't sleep that night hearing the little one cry. Greer pounced quickly. Mr. Alvarez, are you certain? Memory plays tricks. Perhaps you misheard. Perhaps... But Miguel's eyes flashed, and his voice grew firmer. I know what I saw. I'd stake my word on it. Rosie's chest loosened slightly as she listened, though fear still lingered in her eyes. Daniel watched her carefully, his heart twisting at the thought of an 8-year-old shouldering such a weight in a place so unforgiving. Next came the surprise testimony of Officer Morales, who had been called by Rachel. Morales, in his uniform, stood tall before the bench. Your Honor, I was present when Henry Carter came to Officer Hayes's property days ago. His words were clear. He demanded money in exchange for leaving the children. That is not guardianship. It is extortion. Gasps rippled through the room. Henry's face reddened, Marjorie's eyes darting sharply toward Greer, who quickly raised an objection, but Judge Whitaker silenced him with a stern look. Finally, Rachel turned to Rosie. The little girl's knees trembled as she walked toward the stand. She seemed so small against the towering wood and high ceilings, but her green eyes held a flicker of resolve. Helen, seated nearby, mouthed the words, "You can do this." Rosie placed her hand on the Bible, her voice barely above a whisper, as she swore to tell the truth. Rachel's questions were gentle, careful. Rosie, can you tell the court what happened the night you went to your aunt and uncle's house? Rosie clutched the edge of the stand, her knuckles white. I asked them to let us stay. I promised I'd do all the chores, but they said no. Uncle told me to leave, and Aunt shut the door. I had nowhere else to go. Her voice cracked, but she lifted her chin, tears brimming. They didn't want us. Officer Hayes found us later. If he hadn't, my brother and I, we wouldn't be here today. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words settling like a stone in the air. Even Judge Whitaker's stern expression softened for a fleeting moment before he composed himself again. When Rosie returned to her seat, Daniel bent down and whispered, "You were brave. Braver than anyone here." Rosie's small hand slipped into his, her grip trembling but steady. As the session adjourned for recess, Daniel caught sight of townsfolk whispering in the back. Some faces now showed doubt toward the Carters. Others nodded quietly, as though beginning to understand the truth. Still, Daniel knew the fight was far from over. Greer would not relent easily, and shadows of rumor had already begun to stir beyond the courthouse walls. Outside, as drizzle pattered against the courthouse steps, Daniel stood with Rosie, Ethan, and Helen. Morales lingered nearby, his steady presence offering unspoken support. Rook pressed close to Rosie, tail brushing against her side like a shield. The battle for guardianship had begun, and though the law was a cold, heavy thing, Daniel silently vowed it would not extinguish the fragile flame of hope that had begun to grow inside the children he had come to call his own. The following morning, Willow Creek awoke beneath a sky the color of dull pewter. The streets glistened with rain from the night before, and the town buzzed with whispers carried as easily as the chill wind that swept through the narrow avenues. The courthouse drama had already spilled into the local press, and now the whole community seemed to carry an opinion about Officer Daniel Hayes, the 2 children in his care, and whether blood or compassion defined a family. Daniel stepped into the police station, the familiar scent of coffee and old files mingling with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished, but the weight of scrutiny clung to him like a second skin. Officers who once greeted him with casual warmth now gave sidelong glances. Some nodded curtly, others quickly found papers to shuffle. Only a few offered genuine smiles. At the far desk sat Sergeant Bill Anders, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with thinning blonde hair and a ruddy complexion. His blue eyes, though sharp, often carried weariness born of decades in uniform. Anders had mentored Daniel when he first joined the force, but he was a cautious man, wary of stepping into personal storms. "Morning, Hayes," Anders muttered, his voice low as he scanned a report. "Heard court didn't end yesterday. Folks are talking." Daniel stiffened. "They've been talking since the moment I took those kids in." Anders sighed, rubbing his temple. "Just watch yourself. The department doesn't like controversy." His words weren't cruel, but they landed like a warning cloaked in care. Before Daniel could reply, the front doors opened. Claire Jennings, a reporter for the Willow Creek Chronicle, strode in. She was in her late 20s, with straight black hair cut neatly at her shoulders, gray eyes sharp with curiosity, and a lean frame wrapped in a long trench coat. Claire was ambitious, her pen quick to capture stories that sold papers, but she wasn't cruel, only determined to carve her place in a field where small-town news rarely made ripples. "Officer Hayes," she called, her heels clicking against the floor. "Care to comment on the custody battle? The Carters are telling neighbors you're exploiting the children for sympathy." Every head in the station turned. Daniel's jaw flexed, but he kept his tone measured. "No comment, Ms. Jennings. And I'd appreciate you keeping the children's faces out of your paper." Claire smirked slightly, jotting in her notebook. "Public wants to know, officer, but—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Not everyone believes the Carters. I've heard things that don't add up. Maybe the truth is a bigger story than they think." Her eyes flicked toward him, holding a hint of respect beneath the curiosity, before she turned and swept out into the gray morning. Daniel exhaled slowly. Rook, who had lain quietly near his desk, stood and pressed against his leg as if grounding him. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, broad-chested with thick black and silver fur, and a scar across his left ear from a past K-9 mission. His amber eyes were steady, a silent promise of loyalty. Daniel scratched behind his ear. "You and me, boy. We just keep moving forward." Meanwhile, across town, Rosie sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with Helen. The girl tried to focus on a spelling workbook Helen had found in storage, but her mind wandered each time she heard footsteps outside or the faint chatter of passing neighbors. Helen, tall and slender with streaks of silver in her dark hair, glanced up from kneading bread dough. "Don't let the whispers get to you, sweetheart. People love to talk when they don't know the truth." Rosie bit her lip. "But what if they believe Aunt Marjorie? What if they think we don't belong here?" She hugged Ethan tighter against her lap, the baby cooing, oblivious to her fear. Helen set aside the dough and crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from Rosie's face. "I've lived in this town my whole life. Folks can be cruel with their tongues, but they'll come around when they see the truth. And truth, Rosie, has a way of shining through no matter how thick the clouds." That evening, Daniel returned home to find Miguel Alvarez waiting on the porch. Miguel, still in his work boots and plaid shirt, carried a bag of groceries. His weathered face broke into a small smile. "Brought some things. Thought the little one might need more formula, and Rosie could use some fresh fruit." Rosie's eyes widened in gratitude as she took the bag, Ethan clapping his hands at the sight of a bright red apple. Miguel patted Daniel's shoulder. "Don't let Carter scare you. People around here, they saw what you did. They know the kind of man you are." Not long after Miguel left, headlights flashed outside again. This time it was Morales, his dark eyes serious as he stepped into the kitchen. "News is spreading fast," he said, dropping his cap on the table. "Carters are leaning on every connection they have. Heard Marjorie's sister works with the county office. They might push paperwork to make it messy for you." Daniel leaned back, frustration pulling at the corners of his mouth. "So they'll play dirty." Figures Morales shrugged. "Then we make sure every stone is turned over. Rachel Donovan's already filing motions. But be prepared. It'll get uglier before it gets better." As the adults spoke, Rosie sat on the rug with Rook, Ethan resting in her lap. The German Shepherd lowered his great head into her arms, letting the girl stroke his scarred ear. Rosie whispered softly, almost like a prayer. "They can't take us away, right, Rook? You won't let them." The dog licked her cheek, and for the first time all day she smiled. The next morning, a new article appeared in the Chronicle. The headline read, "Custody Clash. Carter's Claim. Officer Overstepped Law." Beneath it, however, was a smaller column penned by Claire Jennings. "Neighbors speak out. Did Carters abandon the children?" The piece quoted Miguel and hinted at others willing to come forward. It wasn't salvation, but it was a counterweight against the Carters' narrative. At the station, Anders folded the paper, shaking his head. "Looks like the town's splitting down the middle." He looked at Daniel with something like reluctant admiration. "Careful, Hayes. You're fighting more than just them. You're fighting the way people here see family." Daniel's gaze hardened. "Then it's a fight worth having." That night, as the farmhouse settled into quiet, Daniel sat by the window, watching frost creep along the glass. Rosie and Ethan slept upstairs, Helen humming softly as she finished her mending. Rook lay at his feet, ears flicking at every creak of the old house. The storm outside, rumors, whispers, half-truths, was growing louder, but inside the farmhouse a fragile sense of home continued to strengthen. And Daniel, though wearied by doubt, vowed that no rumor would tear it apart. Snow fell lightly over Willow Creek, dusting rooftops and turning the main street into a watercolor of gray and white. The storm of rumors that had divided the town was far from over. But a new tension began to coil around Daniel Hayes's life, something darker than gossip. He sensed it first in the stillness of the air when he stepped onto his porch in the morning, Rook's low growl vibrating as the dog scanned the tree line beyond the yard. That afternoon, Daniel met with Rachel Donovan at her office above the bakery. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old law books, stacks of files piled neatly on her desk. Rachel, in her gray suit with her chestnut hair tied back, adjusted her glasses as she spoke. "The Carters have filed new evidence," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. Her voice carried both irritation and caution. "They claim to have receipts showing they purchased medicine and food for Rosie and Ethan. They'll use this to argue they provided care." Daniel's storm-gray eyes narrowed as he scanned the papers. "But those dates, they're after the funeral." Weeks after, Rachel nodded. "Exactly. Forged or purchased to create a trail. Clifford Greer knows how to plant seeds of doubt. If we don't dismantle this, the judge might see neglect on your part instead of theirs." Before Daniel could reply, Helen entered carrying Ethan. She had agreed to meet them in town so Rosie could attend a church youth gathering, a chance for her to feel like a child again for a few hours. Helen's tall frame seemed tired but steady, her silver-streaked hair pinned neatly. She lowered herself into a chair, bouncing Ethan gently on her knee. "Rosie needs normal moments, Daniel," Helen said softly. "If she lives every day in fear of losing her place here, she'll forget what it means to laugh." Daniel's gaze softened. "She deserves more than fear. We'll fight this." As they left the office, a man leaned against a lamppost across the street. He was unfamiliar, with a wiry build, leather jacket zipped to his chin, and a face shadowed by a beanie pulled low. His eyes, pale and cold, lingered too long on Daniel and Helen before shifting to Ethan. Rook's hackles rose instantly, a growl rumbling as the man turned and walked briskly away. Later that evening, Morales came by the farmhouse. The younger officer carried a box of files under one arm and smelled faintly of rain from the long patrol. His warm brown eyes were serious as he placed the box on the table. "I did some digging," he said. "The Carters hired a private investigator. Name's Victor Lang. He's mid-40s, lean, with sunken cheeks and the kind of gray eyes that miss nothing. Used to work insurance fraud cases. Reputation for cutting corners, even bending the law. That's probably who you saw in town." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. "They're sending men to watch children. That's what they've..." Sunk to Rosie, who had been reading near the fire, looked up nervously. "Is he going to take us?" Daniel crouched beside her, resting a firm hand on her shoulder. "No, Rosie. No one takes you, not while I'm here." The following day proved how bold the Carters had grown. As Daniel pulled into the grocery store parking lot with Rosie and Ethan, he found Henry waiting near the entrance. His broad frame filled the doorway, his steel-gray eyes cold. Marjorie stood just behind him, her auburn hair perfectly arranged, though her thin smile was sharper than ice. "Bringing them into town, Hayes?" Henry sneered. "Parading them like trophies." Daniel's voice was steady. "They're children, not pawns. Keep your distance." But before he could move past, Victor Lang emerged from the store. Up close, his wiry figure looked even more angular, his leather jacket worn at the elbows. His gray eyes flicked over Rosie, then Ethan, before resting on Daniel. His voice was low, almost oily. "You're making this harder on yourself, officer. Let the Carters take the children, and the noise dies down. Keep pushing, and who knows what accidents might happen." Rook lunged forward, teeth bared, a growl tearing from his throat. Rosie clutched Ethan tighter, her body trembling. Daniel's hand shot to Rook's collar, holding him back, though his own fury matched the dog's. "You threaten them again, Lang, and you'll answer for it in court, or worse." Lang smirked faintly, backing off with casual ease, but his eyes glittered with menace. Henry muttered something under his breath as the three of them walked away, leaving behind a silence thick with foreboding. That night, Daniel called Morales, his voice hard. "They're escalating. I want eyes on my property." No chances. Morales agreed without hesitation, promising to arrange extra patrols. Inside the farmhouse, Rosie lay awake long after Ethan had fallen asleep. She stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the firelight. Rook lay curled beside her bed, his amber eyes open, watchful. Helen peeked in and saw the girl awake, her green eyes wide. She sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing Rosie's hair. "I was your age when my own father left," Helen confessed quietly. "I thought the world was made only of people who leave. But then your mother came into my life as a friend, and I realized some bonds never break. You're safe here, Rosie. Safer than you think." Tears welled in Rosie's eyes, but for the first time that day she allowed herself to believe it. She curled closer to Ethan's cradle and whispered, "We're staying. No matter what they say." The farmhouse grew still as frost painted the windows. Daniel, sitting by the fire with a rifle propped nearby, listened to the quiet and promised himself again he would not let darkness steal the fragile light Rosie and Ethan had brought into his home. The days after the grocery store confrontation passed with a tension that settled over Willow Creek like a storm cloud refusing to break. Patrol cars rolled by Daniel Hayes's farmhouse more often now, headlights sweeping across the frosted yard at night, their presence both reassuring and unnerving. Rook never slept deeply anymore. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, his deep growl resonating through the quiet each time a branch scraped the roof or a car slowed on the distant road. Inside the farmhouse, life carried on in fragile rhythms. Rosie tried to keep Ethan entertained with wooden blocks on the rug, though her laughter came hesitantly, as if shadowed by the fear that lingered after Victor Lang's threat. Helen busied herself with baking bread and sewing clothes, the domestic hum of her hands steadying the home. Daniel sat often at the kitchen table, writing reports for court while his storm-gray eyes flicked toward the window with each passing noise. It was Helen who first noticed the stranger. She had gone into town early one morning for flour, her tall frame wrapped in a wool coat, her silver-streaked hair tucked beneath a knitted cap. On her way back, she saw a man loitering near the bus stop at the edge of town, a man she recognized from Daniel's description. Victor Lang leaned against the post, cigarette smoke curling around his narrow face, his gray eyes sharp and restless. He wasn't waiting for a bus. He was watching. By afternoon, the trouble began. Someone had slashed the tires of Daniel's patrol car parked near the courthouse. A smear of red paint across the hood carried a crude message: "Not your family." Though Daniel's jaw tightened, he said nothing to Rosie, who had spotted the vandalism from the sidewalk. Instead, he guided her gently away, his hand firm on her shoulder. But Rosie's green eyes widened with terror. She understood enough. That evening, Morales arrived with grim news. The young officer's brown eyes were dark with worry as he set his hat on the table. "I got word Lang's been stirring things up. He's telling folks you're reckless, Hayes. Claims you left the kids unattended while on duty. Total fabrication. But rumors spread fast. Carter's plan to use it in court next week." Helen folded her arms, her slender frame trembling with controlled fury. "They're trying to paint him as unfit, while those children would have frozen if not for him." Rosie, sitting nearby with Ethan on her lap, looked at Daniel, her voice small but steady. "We have to tell everyone the truth, don't we?" Daniel knelt beside her, his face softening. "We will, Rosie. And you won't stand alone this time." The breaking point came 2 nights later. Snow had begun to fall heavily, blanketing the fields in white silence. Daniel was finishing a report in the living room when Rook suddenly leapt to his feet, ears pricked, a guttural growl rising deep in his chest. Seconds later, headlights flared outside. The farmhouse gate rattled violently, followed by the slam of car doors. Daniel grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. Henry Carter's booming voice cut through the cold night air. "You think you can keep them, Hayes? You're a fool. We've got the law on our side this time." Marjorie's auburn hair was hidden under a fur-trimmed hood, but her thin smile gleamed cruelly in the light. Behind them, Lang lingered, his narrow figure half-shadowed, cigarette glowing faintly. Daniel stood tall, Rook pressed against his leg. "Leave my property before this escalates. You've already crossed lines," Lang smirked, flicking ash into the snow. "Lines are for bending. Let's see how you look when half this town thinks you can't keep children safe." Before Daniel could respond, a light flicked on upstairs. Rosie appeared at the window, Ethan in her arms. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce courage. She disappeared for a moment, and then reappeared at the porch door, Helen at her side. Rosie stepped forward, clutching Ethan tightly. "Stop lying!" she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry across the snowy yard. "You left us. You didn't want us? Officer Hayes is our family now." The words cut through the night like a blade. Neighbors stirred from their porches, lights flicking on down the lane. Among them was Mrs. Evelyn Price, a stout woman in her 70s with snow-white hair and a kind but stern face. Known for her role in the church choir and her long memory, she had always carried weight in the town's whispers. She pulled her shawl tight and called out across the cold air. "I remember that night. I saw those children crying on your steps, Carter. You shut the door on them. Don't you dare call yourself family now." More voices joined. Miguel Alvarez, broad-shouldered in his work coat, stepped forward from the road. "And I'll testify again, in front of anyone who'll listen. Hayes kept them alive when no one else lifted a hand." The Carters faltered, Marjorie tugging Henry's arm, her thin lips pressed in fury. Lang cursed under his breath, flicking his cigarette into the snow as the crowd swelled against them. Daniel raised his voice, steady as the winter wind. "You wanted this fight in the shadows, but the truth doesn't hide. These children aren't pawns for your greed. They deserve safety, and they've found it here." At that moment, the wail of a siren split the night. Morales' patrol truck pulled into the driveway, its red and blue lights scattering across the snow. He stepped out, his dark eyes sharp, his tone clipped. "Enough! Carters, Lang, you're trespassing and threatening a law officer's household. Get off this property now." Faced with the crowd, the neighbors' eyes, and the flashing lights, Henry muttered something under his breath and turned toward the car. Marjorie followed, her face pale with rage. Lang lingered for a moment, his gray eyes cold as steel, before slipping into the shadows. Silence returned slowly. Morales exhaled, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "They'll try again in court, but tonight, you won inside." Rosie collapsed into Daniel's arms, Ethan babbling softly between them. Rook circled protectively, tail brushing Rosie's side as if sealing the promise. Helen stood nearby, her eyes glistening with pride. A week later, the courthouse was filled again, but this time the air was different. Rachel Donovan stood tall, her gray suit immaculate as she presented witness after witness. Miguel, Mrs. Price, Morales, all speaking with unwavering clarity. The Carters' forged receipts crumbled under scrutiny, their lies unraveling thread by thread. Judge Whitaker's stern voice echoed at the end of the hearing. "This court finds Officer Hayes a fit and proper guardian." The Carters' petition is denied. Applause broke out, subdued but genuine. Rosie pressed her face into Daniel's shoulder, whispering through tears, "We get to stay, don't we?" Daniel's storm-gray eyes softened as he held both children close. "Yes, Rosie, you're home." Months later, spring returned to Willow Creek. The farmhouse, once shadowed by fear, brimmed with new laughter. Rosie ran through the fields chasing Ethan's toddling steps, her green eyes brighter than they had been in months. Helen sat on the porch mending clothes, her humming carried by the breeze. Morales stopped by often, his warm eyes amused as Rook bounded through the grass, protective and joyful. And Daniel, watching them from the porch with the sun warming his face, felt something he hadn't known in years: peace. The shadows had pressed close, but the light had endured. Family, he realized, was not bound by blood or forged by law. It was built by promises kept, by love that stayed when others walked away. And here, in the heart of Willow Creek, a family had been born. This story reminds us that sometimes God's miracles arrive quietly, in the form of a kind stranger, a loyal German shepherd, or a police officer who chooses love over fear. Just as Daniel, Rosie, Ethan, and Rook found each other in the darkest night, we too can witness God's hand in the small acts of compassion around us every day. If you believe in miracles, share this story with someone you love, leave a comment, and remember to subscribe so you never miss another tale of hope. May God bless you and your family with peace and protection. And if your heart was touched, write Amen in the comments to join us in faith.